I think what I'm going to do, I'm just going to start um, uh, just by telling a story you might have heard before, but I'll tell it in my own way, and then we'll just see how we go. I'm not sure we've got all that much time really to sort of go into all sorts of discussions. So I'm just going to tell the story and then sort of see what comes out of it. And it's the story of the Buddha and the Naga king, Muchalinda. So yeah, I can see Parag nodding. He knows it very well. Perhaps the others do. Um, so yeah, the story goes that after the Buddha became the Buddha, after his enlightening, sitting under the Bodhi tree, that he remained for some weeks in the forest, in the forest where the Bodhi tree was, on the banks of the river Naranjara. And he was just spending his time in deep meditation. He was just absorbing the sheer kind of newness of the awakened state of being a Buddha. In a way you can imagine, he was turning this kind of fully free, liberated awareness, just letting that sort of permeate every corner of his being, his body, his heart, and his mind. Um, and after some weeks, I think the seventh week, according to the story, he goes to sit amongst the roots of a great big tree, and there uh, he goes into meditation. But in the middle of that week, um, even though it wasn't the rainy season, clouds began to form in the sky above him. Um, and these clouds grew heavier and heavier. And before long, the whole sky was just getting really heavy and dark, and a wind began to blow. And then there came the sound of raindrops splashing on the leaves above his head. And the rain was getting heavier. And soon uh, it would fill all the leaf surfaces and the crevices in the tree above, and it would begin to fall on the meditating figure of the Buddha underneath. But the Buddha, and he was just sat in his simple robes, um, didn't move. He just carried on. His mind remained deeply still. Um, his mind was sort of encompassing not only his own being, but everything around was sort of being brought into the awareness. The Buddha's heart embraced, in fact, the world, the sky, the earth, the gathering storm, the forest, and all its creatures, um, in this vast, unbounded metta love. And it was a love that stirred not only in his own human heart, but a love whose power, as it were, reverberated down and down into the very depths of the earth. And in those dark depths, something stirred. And very soon, out of the undergrowth of the forest around him, there came this great commotion, great noise. Twigs were crackling, branches were breaking, stones were rumbling, and rocks were being swept aside by some great unseen force. And then from the shadows of the forest there appeared the form of this great serpent. And it was none other than the serpent Muchalinda, king of the Nagas, king of the serpent beings. And Muchalinda was mighty and strong. Uh, he held the power of death over all the creatures around him. The sight of him would strike terror into any mortal who beheld him. And it was this mighty being who now drew himself in front of the peaceful and fearless human figure sitting at the foot of the tree meditating. And the storm was now really gathering into full force. Soon the rain would penetrate through the branches onto the Buddha below. But at that moment, Muchalinda slithered forward onto the roots of the tree, and he encircled the Buddha with his great sinewy body. He just circled round and round again and formed himself into a coil around the Buddha, protecting him from the wind. And then he took his great head, his great hooded snake head, and just placed it right over the Buddha to protect him from the rain. And there Muchalinda remained. And there for a full 7 days and 7 nights the rain fell. And the Buddha remained. He was encoiled, he was cocooned by this pulsating, muscly form of Muchalinda, the king of the serpents. He could feel, the Buddha could feel the great earth beneath him as intimately as his own body. He could hear the sound of the lashing wind and rain. His nostrils were filled by the humid, the damp, earthy scent of the forest floor, the intense aroma of this great serpent's body and his scaly skin, both kind of musty and sweet in smell. He felt Muchalinda's heart, which was benign, powerful and wild, but kind. He felt the heart of the great tree on whose roots he sat. He felt the hearts of all the creatures in the forest. He felt the hearts of the very elements themselves, the water, the earth, the sun, the heat. And still his heart poured forth this great love, tender and inexhaustible. And then on the morning of the 7th day, as quickly as it had begun, the rain became lighter and stopped. The clouds dispersed. Muchalinda stirred and moved away, coil by coil. And once again, the Buddha was sitting beneath a clear blue sky. But it was a new day, and it was unlike any day there had ever been on earth. And Muchalinda placed himself right in front of the Buddha. And there he took the form, instead of a serpent, he took the form now of a beautiful young man. And his eyes were shining with reverence and devotion to the Buddha. And he bowed deeply. Then he turned to one side and disappeared back into the shadows of the forest. And that's the story of Muchalinda. So Muchalinda was king of the Nagas, and a Naga, as many of you will know, is basically any sort of serpent being. And in particular, these sort of they're beings who appear not only in the real world but in the world of myth. And Nagas, or sort of serpent beings generally, crop up in cultures all over the world. So in Indian culture, there's this idea of the Nagas, and they come up in Buddhist mythology a lot. But There are Nagas in American cultures, in New Zealand, in European cultures, in African cultures. There just seemed to be something that's sort of representing something that is sort of basic to the human psyche and humans' relationship with the world. Nagas are often associated with water, so we saw that in the story with the rain and the depths. They're often very sort of powerful beings. They're both at the same time, they're both kind of dangerous. They're to be feared. They're powerful. And yet they can also bring life. They can bring like water. They often guard the sort of sources of water which we all need in order to live. And in some cultures, they are actually there right at the sort of beginning of human life, almost that they played some sort of role in actually bringing human life into existence. So they're very interesting creatures. In the West, we probably think of them as dragons, and and in the East too. But even in Britain, where we've forgotten so much of our old myths, there are many sort of myths about dragons. Although there's quite an interesting difference in some of the sort of Western myths. So even just a few miles from where I live, there's a hill, and there's a local legend about that hill, that about a great serpent that comes and winds itself around the hill. But he's seen as sort of hostile and dangerous, and he was sort of eating all the local farm animals and things like that. So a local knight comes along with his sword and very bravely kills this dragon. And of course, even in England, our national saint is St. George, who's famous for killing a dragon. So it seems that somehow in the West, we've sort of come to regard these beings as enemies. Perhaps it's something to do with Christianity. I don't know. But this idea almost that nature is something to be subdued, is something that's sort of threatening and to be subdued. But it's quite different in Eastern cultures. So, in this story, we have, in a way, something quite mysterious, isn't it? That there's the Buddha, this enlightened being, but the deepest forces of nature sort of arise in order to protect the Buddha. They're basically on the side of awakening. They're on the side of enlightenment. And really, well, what does that mean? And obviously, in Japan, you have dragons, don't you? You go to Shinto temples in particular, and you'll see. I know the one near Atami, for example, the Izusan. It's guarded by two dragons, this red dragon and a white dragon. And that's something to do with both the sort of fire and heat elements, because that's a part of the world near Mount Fuji where there's a lot of sort of volcanic water and so on. So local culture feels it's very important to honor the dragons, both the dragon of water and the dragon of heat. These are seen as sort of protectors of human life. Yeah, the story of Muchalinda sort of suggests that the more that we awaken, the more that we practice the Buddha's teachings, that in a way our connection with those sort of deep forces of nature should become more positive, that connection should become stronger. Um, so, well, that's very interesting. I just find that very interesting. And it's also, I just got, when I was there a year ago in Japan visiting, and I do hope to be back, incidentally, before too long. I'm feeling a strong desire to come back and spend a good chunk of time over with you. But I just got quite interested that, for a period of time, that Buddhism in Japan, some of the schools of Buddhism in Japan, became very strongly connected with some of the Shinto temples in Japan. That in a way that they didn't find a sort of conflict between practicing Buddhism and practicing this sort of deep connection with nature. So there was a time, and some of you might know this better than me, when they even shared the same temples, like Izusan, the one that I mentioned. They used to be both a Shingon Buddhist temple and a Shinto temple. And there wasn't a sort of distinction made between this sort of idea of honoring local nature, bowing even to these sort of the sort of living spirit of place that Shinto temples represent. There's no conflict necessarily between that and the Dharma, although there is a difference, and this is quite interesting. That in a way one might bow to the spirit of Mount Fuji or the local sort of spirits of the place with a sort of sense of well-wishing, a sense of sort of honoring the fact that nature protects human life, that nature enables human life. But that's not the same as going for refuge. We have this phrase in Buddhism of sort of going for refuge to the Buddha, the Dharma, and Sangha, that ultimately liberation and meaning in life come from practicing the Dharma, come from honoring the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas, and the Sangha and so on. So I found myself when I was there, I'm very happy to sort of bow at Shinto temples, but I'm not bowing in the same sort of way or in the same spirit as I would bow to a Buddha figure. That I acknowledge the sort of power and significance of nature, and in particular, in a way, if I didn't have human form, then I couldn't practice the Dharma. So there's a sort of sense of real sort of gratitude to the forces of nature. But in a way that they're not the ultimate sort of meaning. Ultimate meaning in Buddhism comes from profound sort of the liberation that comes from meditation, from awakening in the way that the Buddha did, and honoring those awakened beings. So, we're from a few different cultures here, I think, aren't we, in this group? But just quite interesting to sort of reflect on your own culture and, in a way, whether what does it mean to be a practitioner, a Dharma follower of the Dharma in your culture, and in particular, how that might unfold in terms of your relationship with the forces of nature, of nature generally, or of these sort of deep forces that might be symbolized or embodied in mythical sort of creatures like nagas and serpents and Muchalinda. So I'll leave it there. I could say more because I'm very, very interested in all of this. I find it really fascinating. But yeah, any sort of comments? I'm particularly interested, for example, those of you sort of from a Japanese background, do you naturally sort of go to Shinto temples? So do you find that, or do you think that's something sort of different?
I don't I don't really go to Shinto temples, but they're really close together. Yeah, now that you mention it. Yeah, usually behind or in front of a temple or next to a Buddhist temple, there is a Shinto temple. So there's a harmony, yeah, between Shintoism and Buddhism here in Japan.
And what I've understood of the history was that they were, as I said, they were for a time actually occupying even the same temples, although they had to sort of work out some of the things that I was sort of saying about, not worshipping nature for its own sake. But then in the 1860s, there was a sort of nationalist government in Japan, and they they kicked all the Buddhists out of the Shinto temples because they weren't Japanese enough. they, they
Yeah,
wanted Japanese, which means they often then they found a new temple next door, which was perhaps why they're still close to each other, is because all
yeah.
the priests then had to build a new temple next door to the Shinto temple. But,
What I understand from the history of Japan is that Buddhism was brought from China, and it stayed in Japan for a long time. But Buddhism became very political. Yeah, so the each temple was like a base of shoguns. Yeah, and
okay.
managed by a shogun. Not so there were not really at some point. Yeah, they
Yeah.
were not really following the Dharma. It was more political. Like
Right.
so, for example, the Japanese system of um, in Japan, everyone has to register themselves in a family tree. Yeah, that's how it worked, and it started in Buddhist temples. Yeah, but it was like a little how do you call um so each shogun had a temple, yeah, and that temple was in control of a big area of the of a big land, yeah. And when Japan, yeah, had to open the borders because they had to open the borders um, when the Americans came with new war technology, yeah. And Japan, the government, well, not the government, because there was not only one government, there were many temples here and there, but Japanese realized that they were falling behind, yeah, with war technology. Oh my goodness, they have guns and cannons. What is that? We don't have that. We have to open the borders to the new technology. And before they do that, they decided that they could not keep the system of the temples at that moment.
Okay. Right.
So they said, well, there's just Shinto religion for everyone from now on. There's no Buddhism is going to be Shinto, and so
Yeah.
the emperor, yeah, took power of the whole country as a whole country, not as little, yeah, lands of temples. Yeah, so the Dharma as Dharma itself,
Mm.
I don't think it has been present for a long time in Japan.
Yeah.
But then Shintoism took over.
I suppose what interests me, what's been interesting to me for the last few years in particular, is something that was said by Sangharakshita, who's our founder and teacher who died 5 years ago or so, 5 or 6 years ago. But at one point, he talks about this sort of worldview, because in modern culture, I say Western, but really sort of any sort of modern culture, we have come to sort of think of the world as being essentially just matter, sort of inert, dead matter, as it were. And at one point, Sankarashta says that a world conceived of as dead cannot really be a world in which it's possible to gain enlightenment. And that's just really, really intriguing to me. That there's something, if we have, for those of us who've been brought up in a modern culture, like, like we have in the West, but which is sort of probably came into Japan with the Americans and so on. That there's something about that worldview which we need to let go of, basically. That this idea of a very sort of narrow scientific view of the world. Actually, I think science has actually progressed a lot from that anyway, if you look at quantum physics and neurophysiology and so on. But I think nevertheless, there's just sort of very materialist assumptions that we have in sort of modern culture. And Sangharashta is sort of saying that, well, actually, you can't really be awake. You can't really become enlightened or awakened if you're still holding on to that. So what I'm really interested in is sort of how we do that. And I think in Japan you still have an existing quite animist culture. And you may conclude that that's a sort of useful in that process, or maybe not. I don't know. But whatever we do, I think we need to find some way of sort of imaginatively, in a heartfelt way, with connecting with the idea that actually nature is alive, profoundly alive and sort of conscious, not in a simplistic way either, but somehow we need to become awake to that, become alive to that.
Can I
Yeah.
ask?
Yeah.
I have another question.
Yeah.
What would you say is considered to be nature in Buddhism, or like in this school of Buddhism?
Yeah. I mean, nature is a Western word really, and I use it as a sort of. In fact, I try to use it as little as possible. I'd prefer to, rather than talk about nature, I'd prefer to talk about mountains and streams and lakes and rivers and trees. I'd rather sort of be specific, but sometimes it's just you haven't got time to do all of that, so I'll just use this word nature. And of course, there is a problem with that, is that we think of it as something separate from ourselves. So nature is just really what is. Do you know what I mean? I think from a Buddhist point of view, there wouldn't be that sort of separation between humans and nature, because we've arisen. We are part of nature. We've arisen through nature, and even the potential for awakening. Even a Buddha has arisen through nature, through like human evolution, has given rise to the potential for self-awareness, and therefore for awakening, for Buddhahood. So it's not separate, I think. Does that answer your question, Mariana?
Yes, in a way. I also wanted to. So, could we also say that objects that are not plants, for example, could be seen as also, well, at the end of the day, everything comes from the same place, right? So would those also be considered like nature, or would that be missing the point of the?
So I think of basically everything, all the elements on nature. Now you can't then think, I can't sort of think of, this wall behind me as sort of being sort of conscious in the way that I'm conscious, or of course not. I don't think so. Might be wrong.
Right.
But nevertheless, perhaps even in like plaster and concrete and metal and maybe even plastic, maybe there's some very sort of basic rudimentary, at least a
Elemental.
of something of consciousness, but perhaps in a way that's not even imaginable. Do you know what I mean? It's not. You can't go around just sort of anthropomorphizing everything. I don't think that would be too simple. But perhaps I mean, some physicists nowadays are talking about like atoms and the particles that make up atoms, like protons and electrons and so on, as basically being conscious of being the sort of basic building blocks of consciousness, that there is no separation between what we think of as the material world and consciousness.
Right. Yeah.
And that's just really interesting. That's coming from not from Buddhists, but from scientists. But I think in a way, Buddhism would, I think, sit very closely to that sort of idea. That certainly some schools of Buddhism, that everything is basically alive on some sort of level.
Thank you. Yes, that's sort of the
It's a huge
thought.
subject.
Yeah.
There's a lot more to be said about it, I think. Yeah. Any other comments from anyone? Okay, well, I hope that's been a little bit thought-provoking.
Akuppa.
Yeah.
Yeah, I just wanted you were saying, I think you said something like that we need to get closer to this alive world that Sangha is suggesting we can't move forward in this dead world. What have you come to any thoughts or conclusions about how we do that? What that looks like in our practice? Even just I mean, for me personally, just sitting in nature, just sitting in nature and watching it go about his business in front of my eyes is like just a sort of mini miracle in and of itself. And conditionality, with the central point of Buddhism, just watching that happening.
Yeah, I think in a way you've sort of nailed it. Actually, I have to say, because I'm actually trying to write a book about this at the moment, because I think there's 1,001 ways, and people have all sorts of different ways in. And I've been talking to people about this and how they do it, and it's very sort of rich. But in essence, I think what you've just described, which is basically to practice the Dharma, to practice awareness, to practice metta bhavana, to reflect on things like conditionality of the fact that things change, that things arise on the basis of conditions. Just have that as a reflection going on, and then to immerse yourself in nature. And then something arises. I think something will arise, but there might be 1,001 things that help the process along, whether it's like reflecting on the elements or writing poetry or doing art, or reflecting on the nature of beauty and so on. There's all sorts of different ways in, or making shrines in places, sort of connecting in that way. But in essence, I think that's what it comes down to. Yeah, what you've just said. So perhaps the challenge for this week would be to go out somewhere in nature and sit and do some meditation in nature. See how it feels.
Challenge accepted.
Yeah.
Okay, good. Thank you all very much. Nice to see you all.
Thank you, Akuppa.
you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.